Welcome to episode 51 of the Headspace and Timing podcast, a show brought to you by the Change Your POV podcast network. Paul Dillon, a veteran of the Vietnam War and vocal advocate for veteran mental health, joins us to talk about a message that he's been trying to get across to veterans for decades.
The strong soldier, the strong veteran, the strong civilian seeks help because it takes courage to ask for help. The weak soldier, the weak veteran, the weak civilian hides it and puts their fellow troops, puts their fellow veterans, puts their communities in jeopardy. Weakness is hiding it.
Welcome to the Change Your POV podcast network. You're listening to Headspace and Timing, a show dedicated to breaking down the stereotypes about veteran mental health. My name's Dwayne France, and I'm a combat veteran of both Iraq and Afghanistan. After I retired from the Army, I took on a new mission as a clinical mental health counselor for my fellow service members. If you served in any branch of the military, you're familiar with the M2 machine gun, the 50 cal. It's one of the most effective weapons in the military's arsenal. If the weapon's headspace and timing wasn't set right, however, it was just a huge useless chunk of metal. Veterans can be rendered inoperable if their headspace and timing isn't set correctly either. That's my goal with this show, to change the way that we think and talk about veteran mental health and reduce the stigma against seeking support. Each week, we'll talk with mental health professionals, veterans, and those who support veterans, service members, and their families. We're going to have real and honest conversations about a topic that most just don't like to talk about, veteran mental health. Let's jump into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Headspace and Timing podcast. We appreciate you once again taking the time to listen to a conversation about veteran mental health. On this show we are trying to change the way that we think about and talk about veteran mental health. And I've heard some really great feedback from a lot of people about some of the discussions that we've been having here on the show. And today's guest is no different. He's been having conversations about mental health and veteran mental health for a very long time. As many of you longtime listeners know, sometimes I'll interview veterans who are involved in the mental health profession, but my guest today is not. He is not a mental health professional, but he is absolutely an advocate for veteran mental health. So I would like to introduce to the audience today Paul Dillon. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Dwayne. It's a pleasure to be here.
No, I appreciate having you on. I think you and I have been talking for a little bit, and definitely something I want to bring out a little bit later on some podcasts that you've been on. You've really been a strong advocate in trying to it really change this conversation, maybe even longer than I have, about veteran mental health. But before we get into that, I'd like to maybe have you tell the audience a little bit about your background, your military service, and things like that.
Sure. I'm a Vietnam veteran. I got commissioned in 1967. When I graduated from college, got delayed to go to graduate school, went on active duty in 1969, spent the first year at the Army Aviation Center at Fort Rucker in southern Alabama, teaching instructor pilots how to teach pilots how to fly, methods of instruction course. And then the second year, I knew where newly minted first lieutenants were going. You spent, back then, the reserve obligation was 2 years, and active duty 6 years reserves. And I knew where and you spent the first year as a second lieutenant. If you kept your nose clean, you got promoted to silver bar. And I knew where newly minted first lieutenants were going then, in 1969, and it wasn't Germany. It was.
And it wasn't Fort Rucker. It wasn't
it was going to be what we call the Melvin R. Laird Travel Scholarship to Southeast Asia. So Melvin Laird was the Secretary of Defense at that point in time. And So I knew I was going. I went through the Army Air Traffic Control School down to Fort Rucker, got certified as an air traffic controller, the same certification that FAA air traffic controllers get. When I went to Vietnam, I landed with the 165th Aviation Group, 1st Aviation Brigade, part of U.S. Army Headquarters Vietnam, and we managed all the air traffic control throughout the country, all the mobile control towers, all the mobile radars, all the navigational aids, which were then used by civilian aircraft coming in and out of Tonsanut, as well as transiting the country. So it was an interesting duty, hitching rides in helicopters. I hitched rides with submarines, and they were actually wanted to go out and fight. And that's where I saw the unpleasant side of Vietnam. So and matriculated, mustered out of the service, never spent any reserve time because of there was a drawdown then in 71. They were beginning to draw down. They had a lot of reservists. So I spent 6 years in the individual ready reserves, but never drilled or never got called up. So the transition home was very, very difficult. So it was a very interesting time.
I think there's definitely a lot of people think they might know, especially maybe my father was in Vietnam, 68, right. 69, and, right. and those in my generation, maybe we think we know, and of course we hear the stories and things like that of how hard it was for the Vietnam veterans to return home. But I get the sense we really don't understand personally how difficult it was. I mean, it's stories to us. So when you say it was challenging, the transition back from Vietnam to stateside was challenging. How was it challenging for you?
I couldn't get a job.
Yeah.
I was an officer with a master's degree, and I couldn't get a job. And I had a family. I had got married about 9 months before I left. I had a daughter that I didn't know, came back, and it was exceedingly difficult to get a job. We not only were ignored, we were despised.
Right.
And so it was terrible. It wasn't my idea to go over there.
Right.
We were treated just terribly. So it was a much difficult time. And thank God, Dwayne, that now the country has been able to separate the warrior from the war. And no matter what you think of the wars that are going on, people have come to realize that the warriors are over there doing a hell of a job trying to keep us safe. And so it's a much different time. And people have told me that it's a reaction to how we were treated when we came home. In fact, I had in 2012, I had occasion to meet General Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at that point in time, in Chicago, when he was in Chicago for the NATO conference. And I was a member of an organization that put on a luncheon for him, and I was asked, can I MC the luncheon? And which is another story of the military-civilian divide. Nobody else knew what to do with a general officer, much less the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And General Dempsey came up to me afterwards and put his arm around me, a tremendous guy, by the way, and said, Lieutenant Dillon, it's my job, part of the active duty, leading active duty troops, to see that no one is ever treated in the same way that you were treated when you came back from Vietnam. So it was a poignant time, And I'm all for now all the outpouring of support for troops, because I think it's just a wonderful thing, and it's about time,
Sure. Yeah,
that
and
the country's learned.
yeah, and I think that in some of what, of course, I was born in the '70s after my father got out of the service, but I get the sense that many Vietnam veterans spent the '70s trying to pretend that they weren't in Vietnam, and for a lot of the reasons why you had said, is they were discriminated against in a very real way. And it really wasn't until maybe the mid '80s that things started to kind of turn around, and the service member service was recognized. Was that how?
Yes, although I never hid my service. I had I, that's back then you wore suits every day. I was in I was in the professional services industry. Suits were de rigueur, and I always wore my Bronze Star lapel pin.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was always reminded of my service, and I was always very proud of what I did. But it wasn't, Dwayne, until it would be 1985 or 86. There was a Vietnam Veterans Welcome Home
Mm-hmm.
parade in Chicago, and that blew everybody. I mean, it was unbelievable, the outpouring of support. And I had a fellow Vietnam veteran who was a top reporter for the Chicago Tribune. And he said, Paul, get out of your office and go over to LaSalle Street and see this. It's coming down the street. And it was amazing. I mean, led by General Westmoreland and troops in wheelchairs. And it was really dramatic. And that was the first time, I think, when we ever felt that we were welcomed home.
I remember about that time really very clearly. I would have been about 13 or 14, and my father and my uncles, I actually had 3 uncles who had served in Vietnam, and there was the traveling wall. If you remember that in the 80s,
right.
How the Vietnam Wall, they had a replica, and there's still, and it is still right. traveling around, but I had been taken by my father and one of my uncles to visit the wall, and then there was a gathering, a party afterwards, and even they look back and they said that was really, and it was about that time that it was, and I even remember them saying this was my welcome home, this was my, my connection back. And right. We're talking almost 20 years, after right. the height of the wars. And right. and even in the early 70s when you came back, PTSD, post-traumatic stress, it wasn't a thing. It was only until the early 80s that it really became something.
It wasn't even diagnosed as
right.
1980.
It was it was a real thing. I mean, everybody was dealing
right.
with it, but they were dealing with it it was a shameful thing in a shameful way, right?
Right. That's right. It didn't even become a field of study until 1980.
Right.
So, it took its toll on my generation, even those who didn't go.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, it split families. Families split apart. Some kids went to Canada. I mean, it was a terrible time in our nation's history.
And I like how you said that about General Dempsey, and I'll share a quick story for you because it is pertinent. And I've told this in other ways, but not on this podcast. But I retired from the Army in 2014 after 22 years. And my father didn't want me to join the Army, and he didn't want my younger brother to join the Army either. But, kids will be kids. And so both of us being combat veterans, in my retirement ceremony, so I retired as a sergeant first class, and it was June, I believe. And as they do in retirement ceremonies, they read everyone's, accomplishments in their military career. And then the colonel, in his speech, he paused after me, and then he looked up in the stands and he looked over and he said, and Sergeant France is accompanied here by his father, Specialist France. And he stopped and he looked at my father in his eyes and he said, "Sir, I just want you to know that I thank you for your service And none of the veterans of today would be here right now if it weren't for the sacrifice and what you experienced after you came back. And and he started applauding, my father. And of course, and it was really stunning I didn't know that was going to happen. And then afterwards, after my retirement ceremony, my dad had colonels and sergeant majors lining up to shake his hand. And that goes to show the respect that we of this generation have of the sacrifice, not just the combat sacrifice, but even the social sacrifice that the veterans of your generation went through.
That's very kind of you. That, first of all, it's a wonderful thing to happen to your dad. I mean, it's to receive that kind of recognition, and it's a wonderful story for you to tell, and I greatly appreciate it. It's very kind of you to say that.
Well, and I think and that goes back to exactly what General Dempsey says, and I firmly do believe that is a sentiment that is shared by many of the veterans of my generation. Even the VA of today wouldn't be the VA how it is right now had it not been for the Vietnam generation, but even the Cold War generation, and now the Gulf War I vets coming back,
Right.
And it has been a sacrifice, and it has been a huge impact, but especially on mental health. I mean, you said earlier about separating the war from the warrior, and you had you might recall, and I'll make sure that this is in the show notes, but you had a conversation with Byron Chin on the Success Vets podcast, and I listened to that, and you said that on that podcast too, about how we've finally been able to separate the war from the warrior. And I wrote a blog post about that, but that struck me because that can be, in some ways we have done that as far as not having the stigma of combat on the veteran, but I think we still have a ways to go about mental health, separating the mental health from the warrior.
Right.
If you know what I mean.
I do, and and as you stated at the beginning of your program, I am not a clinician, but I have a background. My background in mental health is more academic and policy. I spent 9 years as a trustee of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, which is the largest independent nonprofit school of psychology, graduate school of psychology in the United States, with over 4,000 students, not only in Chicago, but in California and Washington, D.C. And then I spent 3 years as a public member and commissioner on the National Commission for Case Manager Certification, which certified case managers not only in the health sciences, but in the psychological services and social services as well. So from those two professional policy-making organizations, I became pretty interested in mental health, and one of the primary responsibilities, duties, advocacy of the Kennedy Forum is to erase that stigma.
Right.
Not only in the military, but as you know, Dwayne, it's in the civilian population too.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's in many employers who and there's not a lot of understanding about it. It's not something, obviously, in an employment interview, you can't ask someone whether or not they have a mental health diagnosis. And so in anecdotal evidence, many veterans that I talk to, that employers will just assume that a veteran, any combat veteran, has had PTSD. And so in many ways, in the mental health ways, they're still not separating the psychological war from the warrior. And it's really holding veterans back. And so then it makes the veteran not want to talk about it. It becomes this very, as you said, stigmatizing or very hushed thing.
Right. And it shouldn't be, because as we know, and your listeners know who are clinicians, mental illness, substance abuse, post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injuries are not weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
They are not moral failings. You're not a weak person because you have these. They are diseases.
Mm-hmm.
Just like cancer is a disease, just like heart disease. They are diseases. Diabetes, it's just like that, and they can be cured,
Mm-hmm.
or at least the symptoms alleviated.
Right. And that's what I often explain is with those conditions, though. Whenever the first signs of diabetes starts to appear, then one hopefully would go to the doctor, get it diagnosed. It's in stage 1, and they're able to make lifestyle changes around that. Heart disease, cancer, we want to get it at stage 1 rather than wait till it's stage 4. But with mental health, a lot of times it's not preventive. It's not going in for that checkup and, hey, how are you feeling? I'm a little down. It's after, a catastrophe has occurred. I often say if I were an emergency room doctor instead of a therapist, I'd be, dealing with like open wounds and bleeding cuts and everything, because usually veterans specifically that I see will come out only after something catastrophic has happened.
And see, Patrick Kennedy is this, former Congressman Kennedy is the creator of the Kennedy Forum, has this wonderful phrase, mantra, we should get a checkup from the neck up.
Mm-hmm.
And another part of the work of the Kennedy Forum is to ensure the melding of psychological health with physical health, that when you go into your physician for your annual checkup, that you're asked about, are you under any stress? You're the clinician, the questions they ask,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But you're asked those questions in the same way that you're asked, are you having any stomach problems, heart? I mean, it should be part of overall diagnosis and treatment up front.
Mm-hmm.
And I would gather that we need some work on that issue, to get it that way.
Right, and I think there is, and a lot of what the Kennedy Forum is, it's bringing the conversation out, and for the listeners, and we'll make sure that the Kennedy Forum's website is in the show notes. But it's not specifically for veteran mental health; it's really for all mental health. I mean, I often say, I want to make veteran mental health as common as talking about the weather, but the Kennedy Forum, and correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, is really about just mental health in general, getting it all out there.
Yeah, and let me read it. I mean, I want to read the mission statement,
yeah,
so that everybody gets it right. The mission of the Kennedy Forum is to seek to unite the healthcare system and rally the mental health community around a common set of principles, fully implement the 2008 parity law, bring business leaders and government agencies together to eliminate issues of stigma, work with providers to guarantee equal access to care, ensure that policymakers have the tools they need to craft better policy, and give consumers a way to understand their rights. So, it's really about mental health care in general. Veterans are just a small part, but a very important part of that mission.
Yes, and I agree, and that's obviously where your focus and your involvement in the Kennedy Forum has been to bring the veteran mental health, this idea of commonality out in the veteran community. I wonder, though, Paul, how has it been received by veterans? Is there a challenge from your viewpoint in getting veterans to talk about this?
Oh, Dwayne. You were in there. What's the ethos of the warrior?
Yeah,
no
right.
defects,
Yeah.
0 defects, ready for duty, 110%, sir, ma'am, right?
Yeah.
No failings. And that's the problem is, too many people to this date have looked upon mental health issues, traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress, substance abuse, as a moral failing. It isn't. It just isn't. And so we've got to get that message over to both active duty troops and to veterans, but also, the message that these are diseases and that they can be cured. And it's this is very important, Dwayne, very important. This is the key of this interview. The strong soldier, the strong veteran, the strong civilian seeks help because it takes courage to ask for help. The weak soldier, the weak veteran, the weak civilian hides it and puts their fellow troops, puts their fellow veterans, puts their communities in jeopardy.
Yeah.
Weakness is hiding it.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, I recognize that. I mean, it is about mission readiness, and almost we have to think opposite of this. That standing up and saying, hey, it's and I've said it before. I had 3 combat tours back to back over, I think it was like 4 years.
Right.
And my wife and I went to marriage counseling after my Iraq and after my Afghanistan. My first Afghanistan. And if it weren't for those, who knows what would have happened. And to be able to stand up and say, you know what, I was talking to someone earlier today that combat changes us. It doesn't make us broken. It doesn't make us bad. It doesn't make us horrible, but it does change us. The experience, just military in general, changes us. And then to be able to recognize that for me to be at my best, both while I'm still serving if I'm active duty, or to have a life of peace and joy and happiness and grandchildren and things like that, then I need to nip things in the bud. And that's where I talk to veterans today that it doesn't take 15, 18, 20 years as it did the Vietnam generation to be able to start to come to terms with this, that a lot of veterans need to start coming out now 2 to 3 years so they're not experiencing what some of your brothers and sisters went through.
Right. And that the message is out there and the services are out there to help, so you don't have to go hunting for them. They're there. They're in the VA. They're in community-based settings like yours. They're out there. There's a lot of help out there. Go get it.
Yeah, I think that, and as I was leaving the military in 2014, and even now, and still staying connected to some of that, the external stigma isn't as prevalent as it was even 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, senior leaders are actually coming out and saying, heck yeah. I've been blown up 3 times. Of course I'm going to go see somebody and things like that. And so there's still, like, the external stigma is starting to reduce. But from what I'm seeing, the internal stigma, the judgment that the veteran has, that's still strong.
Unfortunately, you're probably right. And it shouldn't be. And we've got to break down that message. Commanders, active duty commanders got to bring the message that it's okay. It's okay to seek help. And so when people transition out, if they haven't gotten help in the military, they should get it as a veteran. There's plenty of it out there.
Sure. And I think one of the common things that I've started to see in some of the other podcast hosts and some of the shows that they saw was that a veteran will need permission, maybe sometimes that they need permission from another veteran. They need permission from someone. Not to say that someone says you're allowed to do it, but that it's okay to do it. And part of the Kennedy Forum is they have an annual forum, an annual discussion about mental health. And this past January, someone did come out and talk about their struggle with mental health, and sort of come out and reduce that and say, I struggled with it, and I'm talking about it. So could you? Would you like to talk about that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I think that we, and it was, this year was Michael Phelps and Tom Arnold, the comedian, and last year it was Elizabeth Vargas from ABC7. I mean, we have these images of celebrities as leading a charmed life. In many aspects they do, but everyone is subject to mental illness. Mm-hmm. It's in every family. It's in every family. If people like Michael Phelps and Elizabeth Vargas and Tom Arnold and others could say, I saw it and needed to be treated, why can't you? I mean, I think it's a powerful message.
Yeah, and I think that, and especially, and I'll make sure that the video between David Axelrod and Michael Phelps, that interview is in the show notes as well. Right. But Michael Phelps was literally at the top of his game, and as he explains in this interview, it was after the Olympics, after he had won all these gold medals, that he had this severe depression that he had actually seriously contemplated suicide. And so someone would look at that and say, how can someone that has everything going for them, has literally crowns of laurels resting on their head, still struggle with this? But as a mental health professional, I could see how that would happen, and the same thing would happen maybe when a veteran comes back from combat, that they had this very intense emotional experience, and now what do I do with my life? Now I'm lost. Now what's next? And if I don't know what's next, that can lead to a very despairing place. And for somebody like Michael Phelps, and everybody knows, the winningest Olympian, all the medals, but someone like that would be able to come out and talk about something intensely personal, and yet a veteran can't, I guess, go out and talk in a very local way to his family or maybe a mental health professional. It's a challenge.
It is, but it's the example of Phelps and celebrities like him, that should pave the way. I mean, look at, if he can do it, why can't you?
Right.
I mean, it isn't anything to be ashamed of, and we've got to get over that hump, that it's something to be hidden. It should not be hidden. It's in every family. Everybody, experiences it in their family, workplace, whatever. Don't hide it. Correct it. And it can be either cured or at least the symptoms alleviated, But if you hide it, it don't get help, you've got a big problem,
Right, and that's where things will really kind of unravel, and this is, again, the reason why this podcast and the blog and many of us are trying to at least get the message out there, is because people have a lot of misconceptions. As you said, some people may see post-traumatic stress disorder as moral failings and things like that, but there are biological and physiological changes in the brain that occur.
Right.
Paul, you had one tour in Vietnam, and definitely not comparing one tour to the other, but many veterans, I was not at home for any period for one full year from 2006 to 2013. I was deployed, I was training, I was out, and my children were toddlers when we started, and they were approaching high school whenever I ended. And that takes a toll. That takes a toll on the family system, but it also takes a physical toll on the brain. And so really to back up what you're talking about, from yours in the policy standpoint and me from a clinical standpoint, it does impact our brains, and that impacts our thoughts, our feelings, and our emotions.
Absolutely. And I can't imagine going back. I mean, I thought, after a year in Vietnam, I couldn't imagine going back for another tour. I mean, it was just, that would be, I just can't imagine it, So when you guys go back for 2, 3, 4 tours or more, I don't know how you cope with that, and I don't know how the nation, can keep up with, how do you keep up with that? Aren't you, the question I've always had, Dwayne, is if you keep sending people back, aren't you exposing them more and more to the opportunities for post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury? Aren't you with each tour? And how do you keep a military like that? I don't know. Those are above my pay grade.
Right, and those are, and a lot of times it was, as you said before, it's, yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full. It's not something that I think we really thought about, even when I started, because I had half of my career was pre 9/11 and the other half was post 9/11. And so even as I started to deploy in Iraq in 2006, we'd already been at war 3 to 4 years at that point. And the VAs at home were starting to see veterans come back. That was really at the beginning of where people really understanding the multiple aspects of this. And it's not it's not additive, it's multiplicative, right?
Right.
It's, exponential almost.
Right.
And it really builds on top of. And,
right.
and I think that's where, again, the experience that the Vietnam generation and the focus that they've had on improving the VA, I can't help but think that Vietnam veterans saw this coming a lot sooner than maybe even the communities did when we started these wars. Did you know what was going to be happening with mental health afterwards?
Oh, no, absolutely not. And I got to tell you, I think the VA does a great job with what they have to work with. And I just go in once a year for my annual checkup, and then I get my meds from them. And then I go twice a year for a blood test because, like most guys my age, I'm on a statin, so I, get my blood checked every 6 months. And I got to tell you, Dwayne, in both Chicago and in North Carolina, I mean, as soon as you walk in, the first conversations are you under any stress? Have you had suicidal thoughts? Have you had any change in your drinking habits, or start smoking? I mean, they screen you right away.
Right.
And very impressive. And one time I went in to pick up a prescription that didn't come in the mail. I pick up a prescription and they asked me, am I under any stress? I mean, it's, so they are doing, I think, a great job in trying their best with what they have to work with, and in screening for this and trying to get veterans help. But there's one thing I want to mention that the Kennedy Forum is a big part of their mission, and that's important for veterans. And that is, roughly 2/3 of veterans get their care, both physical and mental, from outside the VA.
Right.
Either because they're employed or they're on Medicaid or whatever, mostly because they get it through their employer. And Patrick Kennedy was very instrumental. In fact, he was the sponsor of the 2008 Mental Health Parity Act, which essentially says that insurance companies have to treat mental illness, substance abuse, post-traumatic stress, whatever, in the same way that they treat physical illness. So the same payment schemes, same co-payments, have to apply to mental health as it does to physical health. And veterans need to be aware of that.
And I can tell you, Paul, as a practicing clinician, and this will come as no surprise to you, that's not true. I mean, it is true that the Parity Act is there and it's law, but it is not on par with physical help. They're even in mental health in general, and then mental health professionals who understand the unique aspects of the veteran mindset.
And that's why veterans and clinicians, listening to this, should go to the Kennedy Forum website or go directly to a website called parityregistry.org. You can see what your rights are. You can lodge a complaint. You can try to get some action to alleviate that situation. And I think that's very important for your listeners to know that they have a right, and they can take some action to enforce that right. And if they go to the kennedyforum.org website or to parityregistry.org, they can see the actions that they can take to help them over that situation.
And I'm definitely going to make sure that those links are in the show notes so that those listening can go there and access those. But this is what I often tell veterans, and what not a lot of people are aware of, the fact that current era veterans, as you mentioned, maybe multiple deployments, now they're getting medically retired at a higher rate. They're encouraged to, in addition to their medical retirement, they're encouraged to file or apply for SSDI. And then after a period of time on SSDI, then it becomes Medicare, and Medicare becomes their primary form of insurance, which is great for a broken leg, but not so great for mental health.
Right.
And that's really the challenge that I see as a clinician, where a lot of veterans, and this is where the complicated aspect of insurance, I am firmly of the opinion that no veteran should have to pay for their own mental health.
Right.
They've paid by their service, whether it was the 2 years active and then the IRR that you served, or however long the veterans served, that they paid up front. It is a benefit, right? It isn't it's something that they didn't earn.
Right.
And at the same time, mental health professionals like myself, or psychiatrists, or even medical doctors, need to be able to be reimbursed for the services because we are clinical professionals. And so there's got to be a conversation. It sounds like the Kennedy Forum is doing a lot of that to try to ensure that is getting a little bit more out into the national conversation.
Absolutely. It's a big part of what the Kennedy Forum does, and it's very important for veterans to understand it, because most of them get their health care through their employer. Mm-hmm. and they don't they're not aware of this, and they should be. And the Kennedy Forum and the work that you're doing, Dwayne, is helping to inform and educate veterans and the general population, what their rights are in this regard.
And even in your efforts, Paul, and as I'd mentioned, you're on several. You've been on many different podcasts. I recently heard you on Joe Crane's podcast, and you're doing a lot to try to get the word out to essentially let veterans, and not just veterans of my generation, but all veterans, to know that they don't have to continue to go through these struggles, that they can reach out. And I just appreciate your advocacy for mental health in general, but especially veteran mental health.
Oh, thank you. It's very kind of you. And, it's my honor to do this at this stage in my life. And I really hope that I'm one small voice adding to this, that we're able to educate veterans and non-veterans alike of some of these very critical issues.
Yes, absolutely. And I really appreciate you coming on the show. So if somebody wanted to reach out to you, learn more about what you do with the Kennedy Forum or some of the other things, what would be a good way for them to contact you, maybe on social media?
Sure. They can just email me at Paul, Paul, at Dillon Consult, DillonConsult.com, and or go to DillonConsult.com website, contact me through there, or and then if they want to get directly to the Kennedy Forum, it's the kennedyforum.org. And to look at all the programs and newsletters and whatever that the Kennedy Forum has. And then for parity issues, parityregistry.org. And for those people in Illinois, the Kennedy Forum has a Illinois affiliate, and that's the Kennedy Forum Illinois .org. They can go to that and find out what's being done in that state.
That's great. And again, I will make sure that all of those are on the show notes. Listeners, you can find that by going to changeyourpov.com or veteranmentalhealth.com and clicking on the podcast link and looking for the Headspace and Timing podcast. And we'll make sure that we have all of those contact information so you can reach out to Paul. Paul, I really thank you for coming on the show.
It's been my honor, Dwayne, and thank you for all the wonderful work that you're doing. It's of great benefit to those of us who have served.
Much appreciated. You're listening to Headspace and Timing on the Change Your POV podcast network. If you can't tell that veteran mental health is a passion for Paul, then you might not have been listening to our conversation for the last hour. As I mentioned in the show, the experiences of Vietnam veterans returning to the U.S. are almost cliche now, but taking the time to listen to someone who served during that time and returned can refresh your perspective on that. Think about it. During the 70s, veterans either denied and ignored their service or, like Paul, defiantly expressed their service in the face of opposition. The 80s saw a level of appreciation for their sacrifice that hadn't been seen before, and when the 90s came, the Gulf War represented a national appreciation homecoming that Vietnam veterans didn't get. And the 2000s show a mix of all of them for returning veterans. Some veterans today minimize or deny their service, some express it in face of opposition, and some are celebrated. Along with all of this is the need to acknowledge, understand, and express the experiences that veterans have with mental health. As Paul very clearly states in this episode, reaching out for help is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. But that's only until you actually believe that, though. As long as a veteran considers it to be a weakness, then it's going to be a weakness for that veteran. Agree? Disagree? Let's have a conversation about it. Drop me a line at Dwayne@veteranmentalhealth.com and let's talk. I'd like to thank the Change Your POV podcast network for hosting this show and highlighting the critical importance of veteran mental health. You can find the show notes for this episode and all the episodes by going to veteranmentalhealth.com or changeyourpov.com. You can also subscribe to our podcast on your podcast player of choice under the Change Your POV podcast network. While you're at it, check out the other great shows on the Change Your POV podcast network. The show about remembering our military history and reviving our warrior spirit, Changing Hearts and Minds. The show about outdoor adventures that veterans love so much, Neophyte in the Woods. The show that helps get us out of the rack and into the race, Motivation Monday. and Attack Fridays, the show that brings you actionable tips, tricks, and coachable knowledge to help you make the best of your transition. If you're looking for the total package for all the information you need to live the life you want after leaving the military, then you found it. I want to thank Doc Todd for his permission to use his track Not Alone from his amazing album Combat Medicine. Doc Todd is someone who's trying to bring veteran mental health out of the darkness and into the light, and you can get the album by going to therealdoctodd.com. Check it out, because remember, veterans, you're not alone, ever.
The struggle is real, found a feast and lost a soul. Eventually my drinking, it got out of control. There in darkness I roam, struggling to find home. See, suddenly death didn't feel so alone. 22 a day, destination unknown. It could have been avoided if you picked up the phone, but now you're gone, so I guess all we get is the tone. Nothing but bone weeds, overgrown, pushing up stones. I've triumphed over enemies, co-created enemies. Broke out facilities that tried to put an end to me. R.I.P. I'd rather grind in tranquility. Authentic tendency, embrace my ability.
I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing. How this life's so demanding, so much pain, all this plenty. I hurt each time I wait, but with you I'm not alone.
You're not alone.
Ah, yeah. And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, get myself back up again.
Without my Georgia girls, yeah, I'd probably be dead. Cause I'd be taking every med that the VA said. Gave every shred, every last thread of my identity. Conquer my fragility, eliminate the enemy. Deliver me, God, from temptation. Tell me that this life is just a matrix. Need a facelift, back to basics. Vision Lasix, I only feel alive when I hear the bass kick.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head and I pray. Lord, please lend me the strength to carry on and keep standing.
Stand up.
How this life's so demanding, so much pain, all this plenty. I hurt each time I wait, but with you I'm not alone.
Not alone. Yeah. You're not alone.
Ah, yeah. And every time that I fall, I'ma call on you, pick myself back up again.
Yeah, just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone, man. Just pick up the phone, you're not alone. Yeah, pick up the phone, I'm right here. And I love you guys. Take those bottles out, dog, and pour them in the sink. Take the needles out your arm and the gun away from your forehead. It's time, man, you've been through enough pain, stand up. It's time to stand back up. All my veterans, man, Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. Get up, you know.
Oh, I try so hard to have faith. I bow my head